Chapter 9. The event room in the basement had a quiet, waiting stillness about it. Jessica stood just inside the doorway for a moment before stepping fully in, her hand still resting lightly on the frame as she took it all in. The room stretched out in front of her, long and rectangular, with pale painted walls that caught the soft light from the high-set windows near the ceiling. At the far end, the small stage stood slightly raised, two worn wooden steps leading up on either side. It had clearly seen years of use, but it was well cared for. There was something about the space, something that felt expectant. Tables were stacked neatly along one wall. Chairs were gathered in small, uneven clusters, as though they had simply been left wherever they were last needed. It didn't look like much now, but she could imagine it full. "You're not the only one standing there wondering where to start." Jessica turned. Janet stood just inside the doorway, one hand resting against the wall as she took in the same view. "Oh, hi," Jessica said, smiling. Janet returned it warmly. "I thought I'd come down and see how things were getting along," she said. "Hard to stay upstairs when something's happening down here." Jessica laughed softly. "I was just thinking I might need a bit of help," she admitted. "Well," Janet said, stepping fully into the room and rolling up the sleeves of her sweater, "you've got it." Together, they moved toward the stacked tables. "We'll start here," Janet said, pulling one free. "Once these are in place, everything else sort of falls around them." Jessica nodded, taking hold of the other end. They carried the first table toward the center of the room, the legs making a soft scraping sound as they adjusted it into position. "Mr. Norris said something about a horseshoe shape," Jessica said, glancing around. Janet tilted her head, picturing it. Yes, that would work," she said. "Keeps everyone connected." Jessica paused at that. "Connected?" Janet gave a small smile. "Well, no one feels left out of the conversation that way," she said. "Everyone can see each other." Jessica nodded slowly. "I like that." They continued placing tables, gradually forming the open curve. Every so often they would step back, adjust something slightly, then carry on. Soft music drifted into the space. Jessica glanced toward the stage. A speaker had already been set up, the sound low but steady. "That would be Mr. Norris," Janet said, noticing her look. Jessica smiled. "It suits the room." "It suits him," Janet corrected gently. Jessica laughed. "Yes, it does." They worked in a comfortable rhythm now. Chairs were unfolded and placed carefully around the tables. Some aligned precisely, others shifted just slightly until they felt right. "So," Janet said after a while, setting another chair into place, "how are you finding things so far?" Jessica paused, considering. "I think," she began, then adjusted the chair in front of her, buying herself a moment. "I think I'm starting to feel like I belong here." Janet looked at her, not surprised but understanding. "That's how most of us felt," she said. "Just takes a little time." Jessica nodded. "And the work?" Janet asked. Jessica smiled faintly. "I was nervous at first," she admitted. "I didn't want to do anything wrong." Janet laughed softly. "That usually wears off." "It did," Jessica said. "Pearl makes it feel manageable." Janet gave a small, knowing nod. "She has a way of doing that." Jessica hesitated, then added quietly, "I don't think I've ever had someone trust me like that before." Janet didn't answer immediately. She simply placed another chair, her movements thoughtful now. "It makes a difference," she said at last. Jessica looked around the room again. It was changing, not dramatically, but enough that it no longer felt empty. "What about Joshua?" she asked, trying to sound casual. Janet's hands paused for just a moment before continuing. "What about him?" she returned lightly. Jessica shrugged, brushing her hands together. "I just haven't really spoken to him much." Janet nodded. "You're not alone there." Jessica smiled slightly. "He keeps to himself," Janet continued, "but that doesn't mean he doesn't notice things." Jessica glanced toward the stage again. "He helped Mr. Norris, didn't he?" she asked. Janet smiled. "More than he lets on." They moved another table into place. "He's a good man," Janet added after a moment. Jessica looked at her. "He's steady," Janet went on. "Reliable." A pause. "And he's been through something that shook him." Jessica's expression softened. Janet glanced at her, then looked back down at the table she was adjusting. "That's not really mine to tell," she said gently. Jessica nodded quickly. "I understand." They worked in silence for a few moments after that, but it was not uncomfortable, just thoughtful. By the time the last chair was in place, the room had changed completely. The horseshoe arrangement gave it a sense of openness. The space in the center felt welcoming. The music filled in the quiet places. Jessica stepped back, taking it all in. "It looks," she searched for the right word, "different." Janet smiled. "Alive?" Jessica nodded. "Yes." Janet rested her hands on the back of one of the chairs. "It will be later," she said, "once everyone's here." Jessica smiled at that, and as she stood there, looking at what they had created together, she had the quiet sense, not fully formed, not yet understood, that something more than a gathering was about to take place. And somewhere in that thought, there lingered the feeling that Joshua's story was not something finished, but something still unfolding. Back in her apartment, Jessica moved about her small kitchen with an easy familiarity that was beginning to feel natural, even though she hadn't been there all that long. The window over the sink was open just enough to let in a light breeze, carrying the distant sound of the water and the faint hum of life outside. It felt peaceful. She set 2 glasses of lemonade on the small table near the window, then returned to the counter for the plate Pearl had sent up earlier. Lemon tarts, perfectly arranged, as though even something simple like that deserved care. "Pearl said we deserved a treat," Janet had said when she arrived a few minutes earlier. Jessica smiled faintly to herself as she brought the plate over. "She didn't have to do that," Jessica said, setting the dish between them as she sat down. Janet gave a soft laugh. "No," she agreed, reaching for her glass, "but she rarely does anything because she has to." Jessica tilted her head slightly. "She just does things," Janet added, a hint of admiration in her voice, "because she sees a need." Jessica nodded slowly. That sounded right. They sat for a moment in easy quiet, each taking a sip of the cool lemonade. "It turned out nicely," Janet said after a moment. "The room, I mean." Jessica smiled. "It did," she agreed. "I didn't think it would come together like that when we first walked in." "It never looks like much at the beginning," Janet said. "That's usually how it goes with most things." Jessica glanced up at her, catching something in the tone, something just beneath the words. A soft pause settled between them. "I recognized him right away," Janet said suddenly. Jessica blinked. "Joshua?" Janet nodded, setting her glass down gently. "Yes," she said, "the moment he walked through those doors." Jessica leaned forward slightly, her interest immediate but quiet. "He didn't recognize me," Janet added, "but I knew him." "How?" Jessica asked. Janet picked up one of the tarts but didn't eat it right away. "His sister," she said. "Our paths crossed a few times over the years. School things, community events, things like that." She shrugged gently. "We weren't close, but you remember faces, especially when they belong somewhere." Jessica listened carefully. "And when he came in," Janet continued, her voice softening, "he didn't look like he belonged anywhere." That landed. Jessica's brows drew together slightly. "He looked," Janet paused, searching, "not broken exactly, but close to it." Jessica swallowed lightly. "There's a difference," Janet added, almost to herself. Jessica didn't interrupt. "I noticed something else," Janet continued, "something I hadn't seen before." "What was that?" Jessica asked. Janet shifted slightly in her chair. "He was trying very hard to hold himself together," she said. "You can always tell when someone is doing that." Jessica nodded slowly. She could. "And that's when Pearl stepped in," Janet said. Jessica looked up. "She didn't ask a lot of questions in front of anyone," Janet went on, "just led him quietly into the office." Jessica leaned in just slightly. "And then?" she asked. Janet gave a small, thoughtful breath. "She closed the door," she said, "and put a sign up. Jessica's eyes widened. That doesn't happen often, Janet clarified. In fact, I don't think I'd seen it before. Jessica sat back slightly, processing that. It caught everyone's attention, Janet continued. People noticed. But no one asked? Jessica said. Janet shook her head. No, she replied. That's the thing about this place. A small pause. People notice, but they don't pry. Jessica glanced down at her hands. How long was he in there? She asked quietly. Over an hour, Janet said. Jessica let out a small breath. And when he came out? Janet began, then stopped briefly. Jessica looked up again, waiting. He looked different, Janet said. Jessica's brows lifted slightly. Not fixed, Janet clarified. Not suddenly whole. She shook her head faintly. But lighter. Jessica felt that word settle. Like someone had taken something he'd been carrying and set it down, even just for a little while. The room went very still. Jessica glanced toward the window, then back again. She has a way, she said quietly. Janet smiled faintly. Yes, she said, she does. There was another pause, not awkward, not empty, just thoughtful. She listens, Janet added. Jessica nodded slowly. Truly listens, Janet continued, not waiting to respond, not trying to fix. She glanced toward Jessica. Just present. Jessica felt that more than she expected to. And then, Janet said, she somehow knows exactly what to say, or what not to say. Jessica smiled faintly. I hope some of that rubs off on me, Janet added, picking up her glass again. I have 2 children at home. That would go a long way. Jessica met her eyes. I think you already do that, she said gently. Janet shook her head, smiling. Not like that, she replied. Another quiet moment passed. Jessica hesitated. She understood. Boundaries. She respected them. But there was something in her now that hadn't been there before. Not curiosity for its own sake. Something else. A desire to understand. Not just what had happened, but what someone had come through. Do you know, she began, then paused, choosing her words carefully. Janet waited, giving her space. What happened to him? Jessica asked quietly. The question rested between them, not intrusive, not rushed, just asked. Janet's expression shifted slightly, not closed, but thoughtful, measured, and for a brief moment, she said nothing.